Well, thank you very much, David. One of the things that I also have done is that in the last few years, I studied for a master's in end-of-life studies at the University of Glasgow. And one of the modules that we undertook was on assisted dying. So we actually studied that for 12 weeks, which seems like a long time to spend on a single topic. But actually, at the end of it became clear to me that it was a topic that touches on so many aspects of end of life and was, I mean, moral, philosophical, spiritual, the whole gamut. So I'm going to try and compress 12 weeks into 1 hour, which is a bit of a tall order. But I wanted to say, first of all, this is not a debate. I don't want to, I'm not going to tell you whether I am for or against assisted dying. I just want to give you a background on how it works, particularly in the world, and then focus in on our countries. So I'm going to share my screen. Just if you just hold on a second, I'll do that. Okay. Is that sharing okay? Yeah, good. So this is my sort of roadmap of what I want to do today, what I would like to try and do today. So I want to talk talk about a few definitions. First of all, I want to look at the world and what jurisdictions permit assisted dying currently. I want to focus in on two of those places to try to tease out a little bit more about what it means in practice, because there are quite a lot of differences between different countries. I want to look at the countries of Britain and Ireland and where the various legislative processes are at the moment. There's been quite a lot of change in that. Certainly, if you were if you attended last year, there's been a lot of change since then. And I want to look at other, I'm calling it other options, but it could be grey areas that exist in Britain now around this sort of area. It's too much to take on all the issues that this raises, but there are certain ones that I'd like to just touch on, complex and controversial issues. I'd like to give you some thoughts on some research from a colleague in Canada, where assisted dying is now legal, and then try to bring this back to what impacts this might have on our work. I'm assuming that this is an audience of people who have an interest in funerals or are celebrants or are involved in hospice or whatever, but we're people who are interested in funerals. What impact assisted dying may or may not have on our work? So that's what I plan to do today. So I'd like to start with the definition. I'm going to use the term assisted dying. And I'm going to use that because I feel that is the most emotionally neutral term and also the most inclusive. The Nuffield Council on Bioethics uses this, and their definition is a range of situations involving healthcare professionals in providing lethal drugs intended to end a patient's life at their voluntary request, subject to a set of conditions. And it includes both self-administration of lethal drugs, that's sometimes called medically assisted death or assisted suicide, and clinician administration of the lethal drug, which is sometimes known as voluntary euthanasia. The key thing here is there has to be a legal framework. I mean, if I was to shoot David because he said he was in pain, I would technically be assisting him to die, but that clearly is not legal. That would be murder, right? So when we talk about assisted dying, we're talking about a legal framework. We're talking about the involvement of healthcare professionals. Clearly, we're talking about the person having a clear and settled intention and having informed consent to that and having the capacity to make that decision. And we're also talking about there being guidelines and safeguards around that. There are other terms that you'll hear, things like mercy killing, assisted suicide. Assisted suicide, I feel, is often people, when they're debating this, will insist on saying assisted suicide and will insist on other people using the term assisted suicide. I think that's a rhetorical issue, and I think it's because suicide has a lot of negative connotations, but also it doesn't cover situations where the lethal drug is administered by a professional. So it's not in my view, it's not an inclusive term. And the same goes for euthanasia on the other way, because euthanasia doesn't include self-administration. Euthanasia in the English language tends to have a very negative connotation, I think, because it sounds a bit like eugenics. Um, and there are also in green, I put on some terms that are, well, these are the names of bills or acts of parliament in various countries that have come to be known as assisted dying. So in Canada, particularly, they have something called medical assistance in dying, which is abbreviated to MAID. And you will often hear in these discussions people talking about a MAID death, or he chose MAID. So, but those are specific to specific countries. And I just leave you on one last point, that euthanasia, the word actually means a good death, which I think is worth just bearing in mind as we go through. This this map is a wee bit out of date, but what it shows is the countries where it is legal now. There are more countries now that since this map was made. I wouldn't worry too much about the colours at the moment. I'll come back to that in a second. But what I wanted you to grasp was the fact that there are quite a lot of places now. States in the United States, states in Australia, it's not done federally, and then countries in Europe, Canada, New Zealand, so forth. I will come back to that in a little moment. But what I wanted to do was focus in on two of those places, because what they do is they illustrate different models of how this works. Oregon and the Netherlands. Oregon has actually, I think it was probably the first or second state in the United States to enact this. And they have had something on the statute books since 97. So quite a long time, and a long time in which to gather data and understand how this works in practice. In Oregon, and I'm going to look at two axes, if you like, eligibility and administration. And I mean that as clinical administration of the drug rather than paperwork. In Oregon, you eligibility is based on a diagnosis of terminal illness. Meaning an incurable and irreversible disease that has been medically confirmed and will, within reasonable medical judgment, produce death within 6 months. So it's a terminal diagnosis and an end of life prognosis. And in terms of administration in Oregon, what happens is that you get a prescription, and then you can collect the lethal drugs, but you have to take this yourself. And I would actually slightly change that. I would say you have to be able to take that yourself, which raises some issues about ability. That's the Oregon model. The Netherlands, and I think this is quite a fundamental, almost philosophical difference. In the Netherlands, euthanasia is allowed for patients whose unbearable suffering has a medical dimension. So this is based on unbearable suffering rather than on a particular terminal diagnosis. And what that means is that it is available for people with some what they call somatic diseases, meaning of the body, but also psychiatric disorders, dementia, and various geriatric syndromes. So it's a fundamentally different way of approaching this, I think. And if you think of some neurodegenerative diseases, those can last, people can be suffering a great deal of pain and indignity for many years before they reach a final stage. So you can see how those two different approaches would play out in those situations. The other difference in terms of administration is that in the Netherlands, you can opt to self-administer, but you can also opt to have a medical professional administer this for you. And in Canada, where that's also the case, the overwhelming majority, over 90% of people choose to have a medical professional administer the lethal dose. Okay, having looked at those two different options, if we go back to the map, forget the orange dots. I don't want to get too bogged down in detail, but the blue dots basically are the countries or jurisdictions where the Netherlands model of it being based on unbearable suffering is the eligibility criterion, and the green dots are more like in the Oregon model, which is mainly the states in the United States, the states of Australia, and New Zealand. Now, in terms of Ireland and England and Scotland, the UK and the Crown dependencies, various parliaments have or have had recently a parliamentary process. And last year, when I went through this, I was talking about the progress. So since then, there's been quite a lot more progress. I did look into Ireland, and I think that there is a process in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland. I don't quite know where that is yet. I reached out, but haven't had any information back on that. But I think that there hasn't yet been an actual bill presented to the Irish Parliament, the Dáil. I don't really know what the situation is in Northern Ireland, but I would imagine that there hasn't been any progress in Northern Ireland. So I'm going to focus on the four parliaments where there have been parliamentary moves to bring in assisted dying, namely the Isle of Man, Jersey, Scotland, and England and Wales through the UK Parliament. And basically, all four of these bills were closer to the Oregon model. All four would be, if you like, green dots. That's to say that in the legislation that was proposed in all four cases was based on an eligibility of a terminal illness, terminal diagnosis, terminal prognosis. And in all cases except Jersey, it's a self-administration model. Jersey is slightly different in that regard. So all these would have been closer to that Oregon model than to the Netherlands. In terms of progress, I'll go through each one of them. The Isle of Man, you see that I've put in the eligibility and administration, but I don't want to repeat that over and over. The key thing here is that there was a bill, that the bill was passed by the Tynwald in the Isle of Man, but it is now awaiting royal assent. And there seems to be a bit of a roadblock here that the Ministry of Justice in the UK is asking for the Isle of Man to bring in certain safeguards into the legislation. I don't really know how that will be resolved, but it strikes me that what we're seeing here is something being stalled. It certainly isn't being implemented. In Jersey, Jersey's slightly different in that their legislation would allow for a clinical professional to administer the lethal dose, but otherwise the same eligibility on terminal illness. This bill passed in February this year. And I looked at the Jersey government's website, and they say that now that legislation is in an implementation period, meaning this is complex stuff, and you can't just have a bill and then have people apply for assisted dying and it just happen. There have to be systems in place. Clearly, there has to be training, the whole works, and they are estimating that would be at least 18 months. So we wouldn't expect to see anyone in Jersey successfully requesting assisted dying until at least the end of next year and possibly longer. Now, you might be, if you're a constitutional expert, which I'm not, I have to admit, you might be wondering, what about royal assent here? I think technically this also needs royal assent. There was nothing on the website of the Jersey government to say that that is pending or expected. All I would say is that if it has proved a sticking point in the Isle of Man with the Ministry of Justice, maybe it will also prove to be a problem in Jersey. So that's maybe not quite as clear a path as we might think. So Scotland had a similar sort of bill that went through Parliament, and that has been voted down. It initially was successful. It went to stage 2 in the Parliament, and then in stage 3 it was defeated. That means that bill's gone. That bill is finished. However, we have had an election in Scotland since then. The bill was defeated in March, and in May we had elections in Scotland. So we have a new Parliament, and I mean it's incredibly difficult to predict these things. 57 people voted for, 69 against in the final vote. And I did a little bit of calculation. I looked at the people who had been re-elected. 33 were re-elected who voted for, and 31 against. So that you could suggest that is a slight shift towards the bill. But if you add 33 and 31, it only comes to 64, which is less than half the chamber. We've had a huge turnover of MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, and it really is very difficult to see whether that would be successful the next time, if there's a next time. And one thing I would say is I did have some conversations with the guy who guided the legislation through, a man called Liam MacArthur. It's a lot of work. You know, these are private members' bills, and it was a lot of work for him. It was almost like him running an entire campaign. And I think that, first of all, I think it's very unlikely that he would want to do that again because it's so much work and so much of his time, his parliamentary time. He is actually being talked about as a possible what's it called? Well, basically the Speaker of the House, presiding officer. That's what it's called. In which case he wouldn't be eligible to bring in the bill. So it would be up to somebody else to bring in the bill, and so it's an open question whether that would be the case and whether the Parliament would want to consider that again so soon. In England and Wales, again, a very similar model, Oregon type model, and that went through the House of Commons and was successful in the House of Commons, and then it goes to the House of Lords. And in the House of Lords, I don't think there was actually a vote in the House of Lords, but what happened was it ran out of time. And it ran out of time because there were hundreds, and I mean hundreds of amendments, and hundreds of amendments from a suspiciously small number of peers. So there was clearly a very well thought out campaign to effectively filibuster the bill. It's not for me to say whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I will just point out one amendment. It's Amendment 458, which states that the person has to provide a negative pregnancy test. Now, if you read that, and these are meant, obviously amendments are meant as clarification. So I read that and I think, well, I, as a 66-year-old man, would have to provide a negative pregnancy test. I hope it would be negative. Um, I think I'm too long in the tooth. Anyway, I think it's clear from that that was not meant as any form of making the bill better or bringing in a safeguard. That was meant as a spoiling tactic to ensure that the bill would not be able to consider all these hundreds and hundreds of amendments and would therefore run into the sand. So basically, all four of these parliaments seem to be either stalled or the bill has been defeated or is in a. I don't know if technically if the UK bill can come back to the House of Commons, but clearly that's it's met a bit of a roadblock at the moment. So I did want to, I've called this other options for people in the UK. It's more like grey areas, right? And I think particularly people who are advocates for assisted dying would say these are messy grey areas that the legislation would have helped to clear up. The first is palliative, or sometimes called terminal sedation. I want to stress this is not assisted dying, right? This is not assisted dying, but it's where someone is at end of life, is suffering, is in great pain perhaps, and they're given a cocktail of drugs that deal with the pain, but also effectively put them to sleep. Now, it doesn't mean that you get that and then you're asleep until you die, but it could mean that. Um, and I think a lot of the people who advocate for assisted dying will say, well, I know that's not technically assisted dying, but you are basically putting somebody to sleep until they die. Wouldn't it be more dignified to allow them to, since you are this is a cocktail of drugs that is being administered, wouldn't it be more dignified to administer something to allow that person to end their life at time that they want to? So that's the kind of complex, difficult moral argument that entails. Palliative sedation can also sometimes, but not always, depends on the drugs, but it can also shorten someone's life. Now, that, again, I want to stress that is not the intention, but that can be the result. If you give somebody a lot of opiate type drugs, it can shorten their life. So you can see why people think, well, that sort of is like assisted dying by the back door. Okay. The second one is Switzerland. I didn't mention Switzerland in that map because Switzerland's a wee bit different from other countries. The key difference is that you do not have to be a Swiss citizen or a Swiss resident. And I'm sure the name Dignitas will mean something to you. What Dignitas is it's a kind of, um, I guess you could call it like a civic membership society. And these societies in Switzerland are the bodies that kind of manage the process. Dignitas is only one of many. They manage the process of determining eligibility and so forth, and they will manage it for foreign citizens. And roughly more than one person from the UK a week goes to Switzerland. So it's not insignificant numbers. So that means, you could say that means that assisted dying is legal and is available to people in the UK. Well, sort of, as long as you go to Switzerland. Sort of. But listen, you have to be able to go to Switzerland. Now, recently, I've been working with a gentleman who has motor neuron disease and wants to organize his funeral before he dies. And I went to see him last week, and he was in the garden, and I bounded up to him. And I mean, I feel this was really stupid and crass of me, but I put out my hand to shake his hand. And of course, he cannot move. He cannot move any of his limbs. He can barely move his head and his eyes, and he can talk, but only just. Getting to Switzerland, I mean, that's a major, major operation. So in a sense, he's kind of excluded from that. The other thing is it's very expensive. You have to find at least 12 grand to go through the Dignitas process. And then also you may have issues around accommodation and so forth. So there's all, I mean, how many people have 12 grand in the bank? Even if you're at end of life, you might have a house to sell, but to find 12 grand is a lot of money. So it's available, but sort of not really. It's available to some people. And it's worth pointing out that the legal position of people who help you is kind of difficult because technically it is illegal to help someone to go to Switzerland. Now, are people ever prosecuted? I don't think so. But if you were the person who wants to go to Switzerland, is this something that you want to leave a kind of legal jeopardy on your family and friends? Again, advocates of assisted dying would say this is a messy option that is available, and there's a kind of, maybe it's a bit strong to say hypocrisy around that, but it's kind of available, but not. The third thing here is something called voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, VSED. And I recently read this book, Intervals, by Marianne Brooker. Now, Marianne Brooker is a novelist, so she is a writer, but this is a memoir that she wrote about her experience of being with her mother, who had MS and who chose this method to die, to end her life. It's completely legal, but you can see, if you think about it, it's a very difficult process. It was a very difficult read, actually, to read the book, because this doesn't happen quickly. I think you're talking about 2 weeks, probably, of not eating or drinking. So not a pleasant way to die. And it's legal, and the medical profession will support you in this. You could almost say that they will assist you in this. So is that assisted dying? Well, again, it's a kind of moral gray area, but I think it's really important for us to be aware as funeral professionals that these options exist, because we may be the people who are dealing with families after the event. And you can see how traumatic that would be for people. This woman was moved to write this very moving memoir as a result of her experience. And it was clearly a very difficult experience for her. Okay, I'm not going to deal with these in great detail, but I wanted to just touch on some controversial issues and just really to emphasize this point that I'm making, that these are very complex moral maze types of issues. Often people will say that, if we don't really need assisted dying if we've got good palliative care. And they will develop that argument to say, and so if we bring in assisted dying, that lets politicians off the hook, because instead of having to fund decent palliative care, they'll just siphon people off into assisted dying. I think there is a logic to that argument, but I think it's also fair to say that in Oregon, for example, and I did mention that Oregon has had this for a long time, so it gives us a lot of background data. And they actually have some of the best palliative care in the USA. So what I guess that means is there isn't a clear causal relationship between palliative care and assisted dying. It's also true that approximately throughout the whole of the United States, about 90% of patients who request assisted dying are receiving hospice or palliative care. So it's not that the palliative care is failing them, they still choose this option. And that takes me into a conversation about pain and what pain means and what suffering means. Now, I'm not sure if it's very easy to read this graph on the right, but what that is data from Canada. And what you have is what people report, the people who have chosen to end their life through medical assistance in dying, what they report as the reasons for their suffering. And so those are the things down the axis, and then the columns are the percentage of people who cite those. Adds up to more than 100%, but that's because people might cite more than one reason. And pain is there. It's inadequate pain control, but it's around 44 to 48% of Canadians cite that, which you might think is actually quite low. So they're suffering, and they've chosen to end their life because of their suffering, but it isn't because of inadequate pain control. There are other things like loss of dignity, loss of ability to perform activities of daily living, loss of ability to engage in meaningful activities, perceived burden, emotional distress, loss of control of body functions. Some of these things can be solved by palliative care, and some of them cannot. You can't control loss of ability to engage in meaningful activities by using morphine, right? And I think if any of you have experience of the hospice movement, and Cicely Saunders, who was a great pioneer of the hospice movement, she coined the phrase total pain. And what she meant by that was pain is not just a physical phenomenon. Pain is social, it's psychological, it's existential, spiritual, and this real data from real people in Canada kind of underlines that. One of those things, of course, is burden, and meaning the perceived burden on family, friends, or caregivers. And this is a really complex thing, and I think that the opponents of assisted dying will often cite this with some justification, because um, people do perceive themselves to be a burden, and that's real. And it may be that there are unconscious coercions, maybe is too strong a word, but people are coerced into this decision because they perceive themselves to be a burden. And that's real. You know, I'm a carer. I look after my mum. She's 91. If I'm going to be really honest with you, that is a burden for me, you know. And she would see it as that, and she has said that. Now, I accept that burden. I've chosen to accept that burden, not because I'm a saint, but because it's just the way our family is working, and that's something that I've accepted. But I'm very much aware of how these sorts of feelings of being a burden play on people uh, almost unconsciously. And that may lead to them choosing assisted dying when actually that's not what they really want. And that leads us into finally, and these sort of complex moral issues, into the issue of disability. I would say, having looked at the campaign in the Scottish Parliament and in England and Wales, that the key lobby, if you like, against assisted dying was the disability advocacy lobby. That um, amendment that I pointed out about pregnancy had been proposed by someone who is a strong advocate for disability rights. Um, and I sort of understand it on an emotional level. I mean, nobody could imagine, anyone who's had anything to do with disability in this country will think that Britain is a perfect place for people with disabilities. Taking my mum down to Broughty Ferry High Street in a wheelchair is, you very quickly realise how difficult life is for people with disabilities. Having said that, I don't see a direct link with terminal disease, and if the legislation is about terminal disease, that isn't necessarily disability. So I can see again the perception of um, burden as being an issue here, but I'm not sure that that is borne out by the actual wording of the laws that have been proposed in these countries. And it's worth, again, going back to data from Oregon, because the Disability Rights Organization in Oregon has said that they never received a complaint from a person that a person with disabilities had been coerced into making use of their Assisted Dying Act. I wanted to just give you a wee bit of research from one of my colleagues on the End of Life Studies course. This is from Kelly Oberly. She's a Canadian woman, and she's an end of life doula from Vancouver. And she did a fascinating piece of research into the attitudes of families of people who had requested MAID. Remember, MAID stands for Medical Assistance in Dying in Canada. And there were two phases to this. First of all, she recognized that these families faced some often quite unique challenges, stigma, social disapproval, disenfranchised grief, anticipatory grief, isolation, the impact of having a series of lasts, meaning like and knowing that they're going to be the last. That's the key issue, I suppose. Knowing this is going to be the last time you see someone, knowing this is going to be the last meal that you have, knowing that this is the last time you do this, that, or the other. And also outright rejection by a lot of religious communities. So there are these challenges. At the same time, she found she interviewed lots of people who were family members of people who had already died of MAID, and she found that many of them reported positive experiences. She found that people saw opportunities in what you might call the intentionality, because you've got a known date of birth, date of death. You've got a time that you can work to. There were opportunities for meaning making. There were opportunities to feel that you were supporting and honoring your loved one's wishes. Um, I mean, it's an immensely difficult thing, and it's usually contrary to the sort of popular belief that the family want to, get rid of grandma so they can inherit the house. Actually, often the reluctance to have something like maid or assisted dying comes from the family rather than the individual. But there's this opportunity to support the wishes of that person, and opportunities for something. And it was a phrase that Kelly reported came up again and again. Opportunities for a good death, even a beautiful death. It's a strange thing to put it in those terms, but that was that was the term that these people were using. So it's quite fascinating to have that from Canada. Canada is often held up as how not to do this, which I think is rather strange, but actually a lot of everything I've said has been really to underline the fact that these are very complex and difficult moral debates. Um, and I wanted to sort of end by bringing it back to the impact that assisted dying might potentially have on the work that we do as funeral professionals, funeral directors, celebrants, bereavement professionals, so on. And I think that can happen even if these bills don't reappear or are defeated. The picture there on that screen is a still from a video, which you can actually, I checked this morning, it is still available. It's on the New York Times, and it's a living wake by a gentleman called John Shields from Canada. It's a very moving video. It's not for everyone, but this gentleman had requested MAID. So he had a date and a time when he knew he was going to die. And so what he did was he arranged, or his wife arranged, for a kind of party around his bed in the hospital, and friends spoke, and it's very moving. And I wonder if the more jurisdictions around the world do this, the more people will want to have this kind of ceremony. And obviously, it's open to people in this country as well, even if the specific time is difficult. People who know they're close to the end of life may wish to do this. Now, that raises a lot of questions for people for celebrants, for example. If you watch the video, it's clear this is a very articulate and loving family. I can imagine that doing a living wake like this could be extraordinarily difficult and painful and sticky, and could be a complete disaster, right? So it's about, how would you go about that? How would you manage that? And I did want to just echo that slide that I made earlier about options and grey areas in Britain that are available in Britain, because people will be going to Switzerland and dying. People are opting for voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. What impact does that have on the family? We are all aware of, I'm sure, of the extraordinary impact that a suicide, for example, will have on a family, and how they react to that, and how they feel, and issues around stigma and shock and grief and so forth. So if these things become more used, and clearly, even if the two main parliamentary debates in Scotland and in England and Wales have run into the sand, those debates have raised a lot of awareness. There have been high publicity interventions. Esther Ranson going to Switzerland, there have been high visibility statements by people. And so it's raised awareness of these options. And what impact will that have on our work and on us as funeral and bereavement professionals?